Why do you have pop in here? Go put that in my room. This is not the time for that, ladies. Yeah, partway through. That's why we're on the chairs.
Please make sure your phones are on. Please rise for the marching of flags for our Legion members.
Good morning. My name is Aubrey, and I, along with Cadence, will guide you through our ceremony this morning. I would like to welcome you to Kitscoty School's Remembrance Ceremony. We are so grateful that we are here together today, honoring and remembering those who have provided the freedom and opportunities that we have today.
Please rise for the playing of our national anthem. We would like to acknowledge Treaty 6 territory, ancestral and traditional territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, as well as the Métis. We acknowledge the many First Nation, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations. We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. We recognize the land as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting.
Now I would like to introduce Mr. Hobble, our principal, to open our Remembrance Day ceremony and welcome our guests and dignitary.
Welcome to Commodore Hawley, his wife Elaine, our Legion members, honored guests, school council members, students, and staff. Every November 11th, we honor and remember the courage and sacrifice of our fellow Canadians who serve to protect our democracy, safety, and freedom. These ordinary Canadians make extraordinary sacrifices as they risk and often lose their lives. None return unaffected by their experiences. This Remembrance Day, it's important that we turn our thoughts to our fellow citizens, past and present, who have defended Canada and worked towards the cessation of conflict across the world. By acknowledging their commitment to this precious and precarious peace we now enjoy in Canada, we honor them. We see the other conflicts in other parts of the world, and in gratitude, we thank them. I'd like to introduce as our speaker today, he's one of my oldest friends, and a man who's, along with his partner Elaine, he's given his life, most of his adult life, in the service to our country. From the submarine service to base commander at CFB Esquimalt, to staff positions at NATO and SHAPE headquarters, to achieving the rank of Commodore and Chief Engineer of the Royal Canadian Navy, and also being awarded the Order of Military Merit. Marcel has devoted his adulthood to the citizens of Canada. It's my honor to introduce Commodore Marcel Hawley as our speaker for the ceremony.
Thank you very much, Tom. So good morning, everybody. It's truly a pleasure to be here in Kitscoty, in particular Kitscoty High School, to be part of this Remembrance Day ceremony. For what we do here is absolutely important with regards to the act of remembrance. And as we go through this ceremony, it's something that we need to hold near and dear to our hearts with regards to the sacrifices that have been committed. But to start, and it's my first time in Kitscoty, well, I've passed it many times on Highway 16. I just want to recognize and give all of you a big thanks for allowing me to share this day with you. And I thank you, the teachers. And I single you out for what it is that you do, because in all of my adult life, perhaps I didn't appreciate it to the extent when I was sitting in these chairs. But there's no more honorable profession than teaching the future generation that sits amongst us here. And it's you that have the duty to significantly shape what each of these students become. And undoubtedly, they'll all become solid citizens. And it's you that provides them the tools that allows them to fulfill that. To go on to do great things for Canada, and in many cases, the globe. And God knows that the state of the world right now needs good citizens. And I also want to give a special thanks to you, the students. For your duty here is to learn, to create, and I had a taste of some of that creation with the great poutine that was offered up prior to coming here. To experiment, to play, to succeed, to fail, and when you do, because you will, to keep trying, to be social, to look after each other, to have fun, to be courageous, and to be kind and caring. For the knowledge and the experience that you'll take away from your time here will lay the foundation that will prepare you for what will lie ahead. And at last, I want to thank my good friend, Mr. Tom Hubble. We go back a long ways, and Tom, I give you a big thanks for the leadership that you've provided, not only to this institution, recognizing that you haven't been here long, but what you've done for the greater good of the communities that you've touched and been involved with over your career. It's certainly been profound as I've followed it. And as a principal, your duty as the head of this fine school is to ensure it all comes together like a well-oiled machine and that every student here learns, and that every teacher here works to their maximum potential. And I also thank you for the service that you provided when you donned the Army and Air Force uniform in an earlier life. You've been an inspiration, Tom, so I thank you. So why do we do this? Why do we come together on an annual basis to commemorate the 11th of November? Many of you have your reasons. For some, it may be a family member or a friend that has served in the defense of Canada, and you come to reflect and honor their sacrifice and commitment. For others, you've been touched by previous ceremonies, or you've heard of the stories of Canadians that have lost their lives in defending our freedom, and that's what compels you to come. And for others, you're here because you've been told to be here. But in the end, what matters is that we're here. In 7 days, all across this great nation, and for that matter, around the globe, many will gather around the numerous cenotaphs to do exactly what we're doing here today. And over our history, millions of Canadians have either lost their lives or been adversely affected by the many wars and conflicts that have occurred throughout. We come together to remember their collective sacrifice. We rightly gravitate towards the men and women who have served and are currently serving in uniform, for their sacrifice has been great. But I would challenge each of you to further open your aperture to also reflect on and remember the sacrifices of families and innocent civilians that have also been adversely affected and continue to be as a result of war. As we commemorate here today, I'm saddened for what is occurring in the Ukraine. Something that was thought to be unfathomable after the horrors of the Second World War, 72 years of peace has now been shattered in Europe. And we now witness needless death and senseless destruction and suffering. So as we reflect and remember during this ceremony, let our thoughts extend to those suffering in the conflict in the Ukraine and offer up our prayers and support for a peaceful resolution. We can extend this sentiment to other conflicts that occur around the world. So this morning, I'll tell you two stories that are pertinent to this Remembrance Day ceremony. And interwoven within them will be 5 key themes that I'll emphasize. So the first is duty, and I talked a bit about that with regards to my introduction. Sacrifice, courage, leadership, and lastly, but certainly not least, education and the importance of it. So putting it into context, wars typically start when leaders are in dispute, and left unresolved can escalate into one nation invading another, triggering conflict or war. We look at what happened during the 2 world wars in Iraq, and most recently with Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine as examples. It starts with the mobilization of military equipment and forces, where soldiers and sailors and airmen and women are deployed to fight in defending their nation's interests. This often leads to many of the civilians in these affected war-torn countries suffering tremendously from the brutality, leading to the death and suffering of many, which is tragic. Because we see this very thing playing out today in the Ukraine. So to give a human touch, I want to bring this down to the individual combatants. Their experiences during and after wars. Remembering that the soldier, sailor, and airwoman and man don't necessarily have a personal grievance against those individuals that they're attacking and trying to kill, but rather that they are there to fulfill the stated desires and ambitions at the behest of their respective nation's leadership. If we look to Canadian political leaders for our history, it consistently has been their desire in every conflict to preserve the safety, security, and freedoms that we enjoy as Canadians. For the most part, I believe humanity and the human spirit defaults to what is right and good. During the trench warfare in the First World War, we've come to learn that during one Christmas, the Allied troops fighting against German soldiers started singing carols. That led to the guns being silenced for a brief period. Soldiers left their respective trenches to exchange gifts. They even played a soccer match. And shortly thereafter, they went back to their trenches and continued the fighting. It's bizarre, isn't it? I have 3 dear friends who served in the Second World War, and they'll make up the 2 stories that I'll tell you this morning. I've come to know them all very well up until their respective deaths. The first is Joe Wilson. He was a sailor on board His Majesty's Canadian ship, Esquimalt, home based in Halifax. He was a mine sweeper in the Royal Canadian Navy. And Joe enlisted as a 19-year-old meat cutter from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. Next is Werner Hirschman. He was the engineering officer on board the German submarine U-190. He emigrated to Canada after the war. He lived in Toronto and would go on to be a great Canadian citizen. My first story involves these 2 individuals. I'll then follow up with Sidney Cole. He was in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He's from Niagara-on-the-Lake in Ontario. And he lived in Belgium as he moved there after the war, and you'll understand why. So Joe Wilson died 2 years short of his 90th birthday. And as described in the news article that wrote of his burial at sea in 2012, it went on to state that it was on the 16th of April in 1945 when the German submarine U-190 fired a torpedo, striking the HMCS Esquimalt that had just left Halifax and is now in the North Atlantic. And in roughly 3 minutes, the Esquimalt sank. And it took with it 28 men. There were 43 survivors that scrambled onto Carly floats. There was not enough room for all of them, so some were in the water, the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. Hours passed, and the men prayed and sang songs to keep themselves occupied. And over the hours, the men immersed in the chilly waters began to die of exposure. The bodies were lashed to the side of those floats. At last, 6 hours after the attack, the men were spotted by another Canadian warship, and 27 were rescued who survived. There were 16 that were in the water that succumbed. to the frigidness and died. Among the survivors was Joe Wilson. So annually, in the little town of Esquimalt, just outside of Victoria, there's a cairn in front of the old city hall where they have a remembrance ceremony on the 16th of April to commemorate HMCS Esquimalt. Werner Hirschman was the engineering officer on board the German submarine U-190 that fired the torpedo that sank the HMCS Esquimalt. Shortly thereafter, the Second World War came to an end. It was April 1945. The German submarines were then ordered at the end of the war to surface and surrender to the nearest Allied port. Halifax was the closest. But the captain of U-190 wasn't going to go to Halifax because they just sunk a ship from Halifax. So they made the journey further north to St. John's, Newfoundland, because at the time, Newfoundland was not part of Canada, but rather a British colony. And that's where U-190 surrendered. The crew of U-190 was then moved to a concentration camp, a prisoner of war camp. We didn't have concentration camps. And after a period of time, they were released and they went back to Germany. So when Werner returned to Germany, he didn't recognize his country. And because he'd been treated so well in Canada in the prisoner of war camp, he returned and he settled in Toronto. What's important is that Warner never knew, nor had he met Joe Wilson prior to the sinking of the HMCS Esquimalt. Appreciating that the German submarine was doing what it was directed and designed to do in war, and that's to sink enemy maritime vessels, Werner Hirschman had no ill will towards Joe Wilson when he fired that torpedo. So fast forward to when I was the base commander of the Canadian Forces Base Esquimalt, again, just outside Victoria. In 2009, I attended the annual ceremony held on the 16th of April to commemorate the sinking of Joe Wilson's ship. It was there that I met Joe Wilson for the first time. He was the only one left of two survivors that was still attending the ceremony. And it's there where he told me his story. This was particularly pertinent to me, as like Joe, I too was from Prince Albert. In Joe, I saw a proud man, a man full of passion for life, a deep sense of duty, the service and the sacrifices he made for his country. He survived, showing great courage. I met Werner Hirschman several years before I would meet Joe Wilson when I was the commanding officer of the 1st Canadian Submarine Squadron headquarters in Halifax. Werner was the guest speaker at one of our submarine officer mess dinners. And it was striking when Werner spoke, he drew your attention. He was a fascinating individual, and like Joe, he had passion and in service was a dedicated man, taking his duties seriously and preparing to sacrifice all for his nation. So many years after the war, Joe Wilson and Werner Hirschman met. They met each other at one of these HMCS Esquimalt ceremonies on the 16th of April, as some of the survivors of U-190 would attend. So it's both puzzling and fascinating how people from either side of a conflict in which one group is intent on destroying another group in combat, often killing many of their close buddies, and yet, many years later, strong friendships would emerge from this tragic event. For Werner and Joe, this is exactly what transpired from the sinking of the Esquimalt. It speaks to the human spirit, the act of forgiveness and understanding, and lifelong friendships that are born out of conflict. My second story is about my dear friend Sidney Cole, who I had the great honor of delivering his eulogy when he died a week shy of his 100th birthday in July 2020 in Belgium. During World War II, Sidney first served in Alaska to counter the pending threat from what was perceived to be a Japanese invasion. He was then shipped across to Europe in 1944. He was part of the D-Day landings on Juno Beach. As a Canadian, and as the Canadians pushed the Germans back in France, he would then go on to Belgium, where he would do the same there. While he was in Belgium, he lost many of his buddies defending the airport in Brussels from enemy aircraft. And it was during this time in Belgium that he would meet his future wife. He then left Belgium shortly thereafter to go to the Netherlands to do the same. And then ultimately he finished in Hamburg, Germany, as the war was ending, to push back the enemy. And the war did come to an end. He was shipped back to Canada, only to then return to Belgium to marry the girl he met in Brussels. And that's where he settled down and lived. Sidney was a selfless and committed airman. After the war, he devoted himself to attending most ceremonies at the many European cemeteries where there are hundreds of thousands of Canadians buried. He would be active in teaching the perils of war and espousing the virtues of peace and harmony. British royalty and governors generals of Canada would visit him when attending these ceremonies in Europe and would recognize his service and duty to Canada and his part in liberating Europe. Even the King of Belgium, on occasion, would attend some of these ceremonies. A hero in his own right, both during and after the war, Sidney epitomized the true spirit of a Canadian serviceman, displaying the courage and will to do and go where he has directed and dedicated his efforts to the liberation of Europe, so that we could have the freedoms that we currently enjoy. These are two of thousands and thousands of similar stories that emerge from conflict. Leaders in their own right, Joe Wilson, Werner Hirschman, and Sidney Cole, have all since passed on, but we will always remember them because of ceremonies like this. For their commitment to duty, their sacrifice and courage in the face of danger for the sake of ensuring our freedom is most honorable, and for that, we thank them all. So my challenge to each of you here today is to unleash your curiosity, to learn more about what's happened in the past, including wars and conflicts, and the brave men and women who fought to defend our freedoms. Educate yourself, remembering those who have gone before us and the terrible circumstances they found themselves. And it behooves us to learn from it so we don't repeat these tragic parts of our history. So with me today, as Mr. Hubble had introduced, is my loving wife Elaine. And I single her out because she has steadfastly been with me throughout my 36-year career in the Navy. And she represents the strength behind the uniform, and there are many like her that represent the hardships and the sacrifices of being a military spouse. We need to also remember the support that they provide in times of peace and conflict. So again, I truly thank you for allowing me to be here with you on this solemn occasion. I will certainly stick around afterwards, and I'm happy and look forward to meeting more of you again and being curious. And I'm happy to talk to you if you have any questions for me. So with that, I wish you all the best.
Across Canada and around the world, November 11th is honored as a day to remember the courage, devotion, and sacrifice of the brave men and women who have fought for their country. The hostilities of the First World War ceased on November 11, 1918 at 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The year after showed the first observance of Remembrance Day, in which we remember those who have gone to fight, those who made it home, and those who never returned. It is our responsibility as Canadians to ensure that the bravery of our soldiers, both past and present, is not forgotten but always preserved. Thank you for joining us on this day of remembrance. We will now observe the last toast, followed by a moment of silence. Please rise for the last toast. Please be seated. Our Superintendent of Buffalo Trail, Ms. Ray Ann Malayan, has sent a message on her behalf.
I'm Rayanne Olayan, Superintendent of Buffalo Trail Public Schools. Remembrance Day, November 11th, is a day that Canadians remember those who served our country in war, peace, and time for conflict. Our students, Gage and Polly, have a special message for us about Remembrance Day.
This is Gage Middlemass from Uenon School in Buffalo Trail Public Schools. I also serve as an Army Cadet with the PPCLI 3003 Squadron in Landry. November 11th is Remembrance Day. BTPS acknowledges this day to ensure that those who sacrificed for our freedom and continue to do so are not forgotten or taken for granted. Leading up to this day, our classrooms will honor the men and women who have served and continue to serve our country. BTPS staff and students will commemorate this day by laying wreaths, making posters, reading poems, and giving a moment of silence. Join BTPS in a moment of silence on November 11th.
This is Holly Motley from Uenon School in Buffalo Trail Public Schools. November 11th is Remembrance Day. BTPS acknowledges this day to ensure that those who sacrificed for our freedom and continue to do so are not forgotten or taken for granted. Leading up to this day, our classrooms will honor the men and women who have served and continue to serve our country. BTPS staff students will commemorate this day by laying wreaths, making posters, reading poems, and giving a moment of silence. Join BTPS in a moment of silence on November 11th.
November 8th marks National Indigenous Veterans Day. Cadence will now read an excerpt from Master Warrant Officer Sheldon Quinn, 3rd Canadian Indigenous Advisor.
Aboriginal Canadians have been part of our proud military history for over 200 years. During the War of 1812, they were vital allies in the protection of Canada, helping protect the citizens of this emerging country from attacks and invasions of Americans. Since then, thousands served bravely in the World Wars and the Korean War. Without their sacrifices, we may not have the Canada we have today. Today, about 3.5% of the Canadian Armed Forces is of First Nations descent, representing many distinct cultures. They continue to make Canada proud through their service at home and abroad. We should honor their contributions and those before them. In this day and age of reconciliation, acknowledging Aboriginal roles in the protection of Canada will help make other citizens understand what true reconciliation means to the country as a whole. We must never forget the sacrifices and accomplishments of the Aboriginal veterans, especially as we move forward in our journey of healing, reconciliation, and a renewed relationship between Canada and its First Nations peoples.
Today, November 8th, Canadians proudly mark Indigenous Veterans Day. It is a day to commemorate the unique contributions and sacrifices that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples have made serving in the Canadian Armed Forces. From the First World War to the Korean War, and still very much today, Indigenous peoples have volunteered their diverse talent and skills, with more than 12,000 Indigenous women and men answering the call of duty to serve Canada with pride and honor. Even though they donned the same uniform as their comrade in arms and upheld the same oath to defend Canada, at home they were denied the very rights and freedoms they fought to protect. So as we remember their courage and determination during the world's darkest hours, all Canadians should recognize the barriers like racism they overcame just so they could enlist. Many of them served on the front lines, and many of them never returned home. We honor those who made the ultimate sacrifice to defend the freedom we all enjoy today. And we must do better to learn their stories. Stories like that of Private Thomas Godshare. a member of the Anishinaabe First Nations who fought valiantly and died at Vineyard Lake, or that Indigenous veterans like Mary Gray who broke down barriers in the Canadian Armed Forces, or of Tommy Prince and his legendary bravery. But there are many others whose stories are not as well known. For over a century, thousands of Indigenous peoples have stepped up and contributed their unique skills to the Canadian Armed Forces. They have assumed leadership roles in fields across the Canadian Armed Forces, from engineering to medicine, mechanics to systems specialists. Today is a day for all Canadians to seek out their stories, to celebrate each of their contributions and sacrifices, and to honor their passion, dedication, and service, which is a model for all of us. Let us take the time to consider, commemorate, and celebrate the unique military contributions that Indigenous peoples have made for Canada and continue making today. Let us thank them for their service. Merci pour votre service. Let's be forget. Bibliopha.
We now invite our Legion member, Peter Greaves, to recite the Act of Remembrance. At the end, we ask that you recite, "We will remember them."
They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember.
Thank you. I will now recite the commitment to remember. At the end, I will ask you recite, "We will remember them." They were young as we are young. They served, giving freely of themselves. To them we pledge, amid the winds of time, to carry their torch and never forget. We will remember them.
We will remember them. We now invite the grade 6 students to recite "In Flanders Field" by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae.
Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae was a Canadian soldier and doctor during World War I, best known for writing the famous war memorial poem "In Flanders Fields." McCrae wrote the poem in May of 1915 after one of his friends, also a soldier in the war, was killed by an artillery shell.
The poem was not published until December of 1915, but was soon thereafter memorized, copied into letters, set to music, and translated into multiple languages. Due to its popularity and appeal with the public, "In Flanders Fields" was also used to help raise $400 million for the war effort. McCrae died of pneumonia and meningitis near the end of the war in January of 1918 at the age of 45.
In Flanders Fields, the poppies grow, between the crosses grow on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks so bravely sing, fly scarce permitted them slow. We are the dead, short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, ye shall not see the poppies grow in Flanders fields.
Thank you, grade 6 students.
In response, we invite the grade 5 students to recite "We Shall Keep the Faith" by Moina Michael.
Mortimer Michael was an American professor and humanitarian who conceived the idea of using poppies as a symbol of remembrance of those who served in World War I. We Shall Keep the Faith is a poem penned by her in November of 1918. The poem was inspired and written by in response to John McCrae in Flanders Field.
We shall keep the faith. Oh, you who sleep in Flanders fields, sleep sweet to rise anew. We caught the torch you threw and holding high, we keep the faith with all who die. We cherish too the poppy red that grows on fields where valor led. It seems to signal to the skies that blood of heroes never dies. But lends a luster to the red of the poppy that blooms above the dead. In Flanders fields, and now the torch and poppy red we wear in honor of our dead. Fear not that ye have died for naught, we'll teach the lesson that ye wrought in Flanders fields.
Thank you, grade 5 students. We now invite two representatives from each grade at Kent County Elementary School to lay the wreath. Thank you. Our band will now be performing Hope Everlasting. Thank you. We will now watch a video about the importance of Remembrance Day.
Définir d'où je viens, qui je suis et où je m'en vais.
I respect Remembrance Day
because it's such an important date and such an important time.
C'est important de se souvenir.
Not just one single day, November 11.
Le 11 du 11e mois à 11 heures.
I think it's more than just saying thank you for your service.
It's also about the human side and not just the faceless soldier side.
Remembrance Day, I just think about
Omaha Beach, Chino Beach.
Ce qu'on a fait pour les autres pays.
400,000 people took part in D-Day.
La guerre de Corée.
Hill 187.
Stabilization in Congo.
Qu'est-ce qui est tellement Haïti, the children in Afghanistan.
The genocide that lasted 100 days.
For me, it's to remember the fallen.
Toutes les camarades avec qui j'ai combattu.
I remember my husband, Corporal Bryce Keller. J'ai le capitaine Nicolas Godard dans mon cœur.
Jean-Guy, mon ami.
Caporal-chef, the families and the civilians and the people who have to deal with war in the places we've been.
I remember World War I veterans when I was growing up.
I remember Chinese Canadian in World War II.
Ces gens-là ont fait des choses qui sont extraordinaires.
They're the heroes. They gave their life.
La raison pourquoi je suis ici, la raison pourquoi je porte cet uniforme, vient de ce qui a été fait par mes prédécesseurs. We have what we have in Canada today, we thank to our forefathers who have gone before us.
I'm not a hero, I'm a survivor.
Pour ces gens-là, ça vaut la peine de se souvenir et de montrer du respect envers eux.
Le souvenir continue de me propulser, de me motiver et de me convaincre d'accomplir la mission qui m'est assignée.
Our band will now be performing Hymn to the Fallen.
We remember today the following men local to our area who gave the last measure of devotion: Eric Blake, Harry Cambridge, Kenneth Durham, Charles Mitchell, J.E. Potter, Thomas Seabrook, and Arthur Wilkinson.
We would like to thank our distinguished guests and Legion members for their attendance, as well as the Kiscali Elementary School for joining us. Thank you to Ms. Stromberg and our KHS band, everyone who involved in the planning and setting up for our day, and to anyone else we have missed. We would now like to welcome Mr. Stromberg to say some closing remarks. We will end the ceremony with God Save the King and allowing the Legion to retire the flags. Please stay standing during the God Save the King and until the Legion has exited.
Dignitaries and presenters, students and staff, thank you for your attention and respect this morning. This was an opportunity for both solemn reflection and grateful thanks. Today we honored the brave men and women who have served and who continue to serve on our behalf. We thank them for their sacrifice so that we can continue to enjoy the privilege and peace we will never forget.
everyone for attending. You may return to your class or I guess go to lunch now. Thank you to the elementary school for coming. Thank you everyone.